Russia had just gone through a period of instability known as the Time of Troubles. It all started when the last Tsar of the Rurik dynasty died childless, leaving Russia without an heir. Then a whole bunch of peasants got fed up with the ruling elite and started revolting. Then some foreign princes tried to take advantage of this mess and claim the throne for themselves. And then the Russians invited the Poles in to help put down these rebellions, only for the Poles to seize Moscow and put their own king on the throne instead. And if you're wondering how the Russians managed to stop this Polish occupation, well, you're gonna have to stick around until the end because I'm gonna tell you all about it. The year is 1598 and the last Tsar of Russia, Feodor I, has kicked the bucket. Now Fyodor had a younger brother named Boris Godunov who was next in line to the throne. But before we get into what happened next, I think it's important to explain what was going on in Russia at this time. See, since Ivan the Terrible's death in 1584, Russia had been on a slow decline. His successors were weak and corrupt, and they spent most of their time fighting with each other and murdering one another's children. And while all of this palace intrigue was going on, the Russians suffered through a devastating famine that killed off millions of people and devastated the economy. And the ruling elite did little to try to alleviate the suffering of the common people. Instead, they focused on trying to acquire more power for themselves, which led to several peasant uprisings during the 1590s. Now, despite these internal problems, Russia still had a fairly large and powerful army. However, much like everything else in the country, it was totally under-equipped and undersupplied. Nevertheless, Boris thought that he could use the military to solve his political problems. He ordered the army to put down the peasant rebellions, but they came back defeated from every single campaign. To make matters worse, it soon became clear that the army wasn't the only thing that was undersupply. Russia also didn't have enough food to feed its people. There was another famine, and things got so bad that people started eating their pets. And at this point, you may be thinking that things couldn't possibly get any worse for Russia, but they absolutely could, and they did. In 1601, a group of Cossacks captured a noble named Tsar, who claimed to be Ivan the Terrible's lost son, Dmitry. Now, for whatever reason, this story seemed to convince a lot of people because over the next couple of years, several different groups captured Tsar and proclaimed him the true heir to the throne. And even though none of these groups ever actually held on to him for more than a couple of months, it gave Boris something else to worry about besides the peasant rebellions. In 1604, Boris finally managed to defeat the main peasant army, but he turned out to be a bit too successful. See, while trying to chase down some rebel leaders, his troops accidentally murdered a man named Vasily Shuisky, who was actually related to the Rurik dynasty. And when this news got out, many members of the ruling elite withdrew their support from Boris and instead threw their weight behind yet another pretender named Dmitry. This guy wasn't the son of Ivan the Terrible either, but he did have a much better claim to the throne than Boris. And this time the nobles weren't just declaring him the true heir, they were actually putting him on the throne. As far as I can tell, there were two reasons why this worked. First of all, this version of Dmitry was willing to play ball with the ruling class and share power with them. But perhaps more importantly, he was willing to do something that the other contenders weren't, and that was to ask the Polish nobility for help. You see, there was a contingent of Polish nobles who believed that the best way to increase their wealth and power would be to marry into the Russian royal family and unite the two nations under one ruler. This idea had already been attempted a couple times before, but those attempts failed because the Russians didn't really like the Poles or their religion. But now the situation was different. These false Dmitris were desperately trying to stay alive long enough to secure their claim to the throne, and they needed the Polish nobles to do it. And in 1609, they got what they wanted. A Polish force of 6,000 men invaded Russia, deposed Dmitry, and installed their own prince, Władysław IV Vasa, as the new Tsar of Russia. So at this point, the Russian nobles caught exactly what they were looking for, but it probably wasn't what they expected. I mean, sure, they got a new Tsar, but he was Polish and the entire country was now occupied by Polish troops. After consolidating their control over the countryside, the Poles marched on Moscow, which they captured in 1610. This was an unprecedented event, the first time in history that Moscow had ever been occupied by a foreign power. At this point, it looked like Poland was going to annex the entire country, but the Russians had other plans. You see, while the Poles were marching on Moscow, a group of nobles, led by Prince Dmitry Pozharsky and merchant Kuzma Minin, gathered an army to fight back. And even though they were called the Popular Army, they weren't exactly a grassroots movement. Most of the soldiers were actually nobles or former members of the military who had land to lose if the Poles took over the country. Regardless, they were able to rally the population against the Polish invaders, and they started winning battles almost immediately. The first engagement between the Russian militia and the Polish garrison was the Battle of Klushkow. It took place on November 1610, just 3 weeks after the Poles seized Moscow. The Russian nobles were led by Prince Dmitry Pozharsky, who was determined to liberate his homeland from Polish domination. On the other side was the Polish hetman Stanislaw Koniak-Polski, who was a veteran of many successful campaigns against the Ottoman Empire. So on paper, it looked like Pozharsky was outmatched. Not only was Koniecki experienced, but the Polish nobles had access to far better weapons. Nevertheless, the battle went very well for the Russians. They used a simple tactic that proved to be very effective. Basically, the Russian nobles charged forward on horseback and cut the Polish nobles down one by one. In total, 37 Polish nobles were slain, including the aforementioned hetman. After the battle, Pozharsky was proclaimed a hero and his popularity soared. More and more nobles flocked to his banner, eager to get in on the action. Then in 1611, he led the Popular Army on a major offensive against the Poles. One by one, the towns and cities fell to the Russians, but they didn't go after Moscow right away. Instead, Pozharsky decided to lay siege to the city of Novgorod, which was still in Polish hands. While the army was marching to Novgorod, the Poles launched a counterattack and relieved the city, but it didn't really matter because Novgorod was pretty much destroyed at this point. Pozharsky now realized that the only way to end the war was to march on Moscow itself. But before he could do that, he had to deal with another threat. The false Dmitry, who had been backed by the Polish nobles since 1606, was still alive and kicking. He was currently hiding out in the city of Saratov, but Pozharsky wanted to finish the war as quickly as possible and he didn't want to waste time hunting down the pretender. So he sent a letter to the false Dmitry telling him to come to Moscow and surrender. Now, I don't know what sort of deal Pozharsky was offering the false Dmitry, but whatever it was, it worked. The pretender surrendered and was allowed to live out the rest of his days in a monastery. Meanwhile, Pozharsky's army was laying siege to Moscow. They arrived outside the city walls in October of 1612 and began their assault. But the defenders were prepared and they fought them to a standstill. It looked like the siege might fizzle out like so many others before it, but suddenly, out of nowhere, the weather turned cold and snowy. And while snow is usually good for the Russians, in this case, it spelled disaster for the Polish garrison. You see, the Polish soldiers weren't used to fighting in the snow. Also, they had come from a relatively warm region of Europe, and they were ill-prepared for the harsh Russian winter. Many of them simply froze to death, others starved to death because they couldn't get out of the city to forage for food. And after 5 months, the garrison was demoralized and starving. They pleaded with their commanders to allow them to surrender the city, but the Polish nobles refused. They waited until April before giving up, and by that time, most of them were dead. In total, 16,000 Polish soldiers died during the siege. Meanwhile, the Russian losses were around 3,000. With the liberation of Moscow, the Russian nobility turned their attention to picking a new Tsar. In 1613, they elected Michael Romanov, who started a dynasty that would rule Russia for the next 300 years. And that, my friends, is why the Poles invaded Russia. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider supporting the channel. Thanks for watching.